I went to visit husband's grave on Memorial Day, but when I returned home, I found my belongings had flown out the front door, my daughter-in-law said. You should have died with your rotten husband. You should have died with that rotten corpse you call a husband, my daughter-in-law screamed from the doorway, her voice slicing through the crisp morning like a blade. The red wine hit my chest before I even reached the porch. Warm, bitter, and deliberate. She threw it with the kind of force meant not just to stain, but to humiliate. The glass shattered against the step behind me, sending shards across the gravel. My coat, the same one I wore to my husband's funeral, now dripped burgundy down the front like a fresh wound. She stood barefoot, wild-eyed, one hand on her swollen belly, the other still curled from the throw. Her nightgown was wrinkled, her face smug with victory. Behind her, my son said nothing, just leaned against the frame, like the scene unfolding before him was a television program he'd already seen too many times to care. I did not flinch. I looked down at the soaked lace in my hand, my husband's pressed white flower, now blotched with merlot and shaking slightly as I held it tighter. I had just returned from the cemetery that Memorial Day morning, the wind still clinging to my coat, the scent of cut grass and fresh soil folded into its seams. Every year, I went with that same flower, dried by my husband's own hands in 1963, the year we bought our Chevy, the year we started our life. That flower had survived war, storms, and time. But today, it had survived my daughter-in-law. I looked around at what had become of my home. My sweaters were tangled in the hydrangeas, my undergarments were scattered across the lawn like trash. One of my orthopedic shoes floated in the bird bath. And in the middle of it all, half submerged in a puddle, was our wedding photo, its frame cracked, our young smiles drowned in mud. Then my son finally stepped forward. No apology, no shame. If you do not sign over the deed by Friday, he said, his voice low, practiced. That damn honeymoon car is getting torched, do you hear me? I will set it on fire myself. That rust bucket means nothing to me. I turned to him fully, holding the crushed flower to my chest, wine soaking through to the skin. I never wanted the end of this family to come in court, I said, quiet but clear. But you are the one who made sure it would. When I first met Thomas, he was in uniform, standing outside the diner where I worked part-time while finishing secretarial school. It was spring of 1962, and he was the kind of man who said ma'am to every waitress, even the ones who forgot his coffee. He wore his fatigues like armor, but smiled like a man who believed in slow Sundays and warm biscuits. We married 6 months later, just before he shipped out. He gave me a single white flower from the field behind his father's barn and told me to press it between the pages of the Psalms. So you'll have something that never withers, even when I'm gone, he said. I did as he asked. That flower still sits between Psalm 27 and Psalm 91, and every year on Memorial Day, I take it out for him. After he returned from Vietnam, with a limp in his right leg and eyes that had seen too much, we bought our first car together, a midnight blue 1967 Chevy Impala. To some it was just a car, but to us it was a sanctuary. We called it our first home, because we lived in it those first 3 months, driving up the coast of Maine, sleeping in parking lots and camping near lighthouses, eating crackers for dinner and holding hands like teenagers. It was in that car just outside Camden Harbor where our son was conceived. The windows fogged, the moon low, and a love so simple it never needed to be explained. Thomas loved that car more than anything he did not build himself. He kept it waxed, tuned, clean, even after his back started giving out and his hands trembled while holding a wrench. He said he wanted it passed on, not for value, but for memory. He wanted our son to inherit it one day, but only if he earned it. Before Thomas died, before the coughing fits took his breath and cancer hollowed his chest, he sat me down with a lawyer he trusted. I need to know, he told me, that you will be taken care of, that you will never be at anyone's mercy. He left behind a will so clear, so deliberate, it read like a love letter more than a legal document. If my son cares for his mother until the end of her life, it stated, he shall receive full ownership of the property at 27 Granville Lane and the 1967 Chevrolet Impala. If he does not fulfill this duty, whether by abandonment, neglect, or any act of deliberate harm, all assets revert to my wife, who may dispose of them at her discretion, or pass them to another who honors her. The lawyer, an old man named Morris, with hands like tree bark, looked me straight in the eyes. "This is enforceable," he said. "If your son fails to act right, you have every right to act without guilt." At the time, I had no reason to believe that day would come. My son, our only child, had cried the loudest at the funeral. He took my hand and told me I would never be alone. He and his wife had just moved back into town from Portland and said I could stay with them while I figured things out. "Stay as long as you want," he had said. "This is still your home." I believed him. I believed the way his eyes filled with tears when he found his father's dog tags, the way he asked for my recipes, the way he sat on the porch with me that first winter and told stories about how he used to sneak into the Chevy as a boy just to sit in the driver's seat and pretend he was grown. I believed him when he moved the guest bed into the room next to the nursery, said he wanted me close. I believed him when he installed grab bars in the shower, when he helped me lift the Thanksgiving turkey, when he said, "It's not a burden, Ma, it's family." But slowly the tone shifted. It began with quiet complaints from my daughter-in-law, who whispered, "It still smells like mothballs in here," after I finished folding laundry. Then came the closed doors, the canceled dinners, the looks passed between them like silent accusations. They began locking the garage. The Chevy, once covered with a thick wool blanket and visited weekly by my son for upkeep, sat alone under dust. I was no longer allowed to drive, not because I could not, but because I might scratch something. The flower beds I tended were ripped up and replaced with grout. The rocking chair I used on the front porch was taken to the dump because she said it ruined the aesthetic. Still, I held hope. Because he was my son. Because he had once lain on my chest with fever and I had sung him back to sleep. Because the man I married had believed he was worth loving, until one day, while cleaning the bathroom, I overheard their conversation behind a half-shut door. "We can get it over 600,000 for this place," she said, "but only if the deed is clean." "She's old," he answered. "One cold winter and we'll be free of this drama." I stood frozen with the sponge still in my hand. That night, I pulled the will from its hiding spot beneath my mattress and read it again, by lamplight. I read it like scripture, like prayer, like something holy. I traced the handwriting. I remembered how Thomas had looked when he signed it, stern, protective, afraid for me in a way he never admitted out loud. I did not confront them. I did not cry. I did not even move the will from the envelope. Instead, I waited. Because sometimes love does not roar. Sometimes it records. Sometimes it remembers. And sometimes it remembers. And sometimes it remembers, and sometimes it waits quietly for the right moment to speak. It started with whispers, whispered phone calls late at night behind the kitchen door, the kind that end the moment you step into the room. Whispered arguments behind the garage, too faint to hear clearly, but sharp enough to make the dog bark. I pretended not to notice. That was my mistake. They thought I was old enough to stop listening, too tired to pay attention, too worn out to suspect. But age does not dull the ears when the voice speaking is your child's. And I knew, the way a mother always knows, that something had shifted. My daughter-in-law was never one to hide her displeasure, but for a time she kept her insults wrapped in politeness. Backhanded compliments, forced smiles. "Oh, you still use margarine? How quaint." Or, "You know, the neighbors said it's so sweet how you try to garden, even at your age." But the pretense ended one morning just after breakfast. I had set the table early, as I always did, toast warm and scrambled eggs fluffed the way Thomas liked them. I still cooked as if he were there, as if feeding the living would somehow keep his memory fed too. My daughter-in-law came down, nose curled. "Jesus Christ," she said, wafting her hand in front of her face. "This place smells like old, like mothballs and arthritis cream. I can't breathe in here." I looked up from the sink. She was already pouring her almond milk into a glass, ignoring the tea I had steeped for her. "The smell of bleach and resentment must be worse," I said under my breath. She snapped her head toward me. "Excuse me?" I said nothing, just turned back to the dishes. But the war had started. From then on, she no longer waited for my absence to mock me. One afternoon, as she passed the hallway where I sat mending a pillowcase, she muttered loudly to her husband, "I swear, the whole damn house stinks of death. I stood, walked into my room, and closed the door behind me. Quietly, deliberately. That night, I called Martha, my oldest friend, widow of Henry, who had served alongside Thomas. We had not spoken in months, but I knew her voice the second she answered. "Martha," I said, steadying my breath, "I think it's time I took your advice." She did not ask questions. She just said, "Good. Do you still have that little recorder I sent in the Christmas box?" I did. It was no larger than a lipstick tube, designed for journalists, she had told me when she mailed it. "You're going to need it one day," she had written in the card. "The world will pretend not to hear you, unless you make them." The next morning, I tucked the recorder into a porcelain jar on the bookshelf across from the kitchen table. It was where they argued most often. I placed another in the linen closet near their bedroom, and a third inside the garage, tucked beneath an old bag of potting soil. And I waited. Within days, I began to collect truths. "I told you," she hissed one night, "we cannot list the damn house while her name is still on the deed." "She will not live forever," he answered. "One cold snap and it will all be ours." The sound of them made my stomach turn. But I kept listening. Later that week, I overheard her on the phone in the laundry room. "Yes, the address is 27 Granville. 3 beds, 2 baths, but it needs updating. I can get you photos by Friday. Just crop out the old lady." I pressed record. My fingers shook, but my voice was calm. A stillness settled in me like steel. They were not just cruel, they were planning to erase me. I found paperwork too. One afternoon, when they had gone out to a prenatal yoga class, I opened a side drawer in the dining hutch. Inside, a folder labeled Exit Plan. It held financial statements, letters from a real estate agent, even mock listings with "Move In Ready" circled in red. They had not even waited for me to die. They had simply decided I no longer belonged. That night, I made a second call. This time to Martha's son, Alan, an attorney who had handled estate disputes for veterans' families. I had never met him, but he spoke like his mother, direct but kind. "Send me everything," he said, "and record everything from now on. If they're trying to defraud the will, we can prove it." The next morning, my daughter-in-law came into the kitchen while I was pouring my tea. She looked at me like I was something under her shoe. "You know," she said, tapping her acrylic nails against the counter, "if you really loved your son, you'd sign the house over. Let us have a fresh start. You've lived long enough, haven't you?" I turned to her, calm as the grave. "I will live long enough to watch you leave," I said. She blinked. I smiled. That evening, I replayed the audio clips from myself, alone in my room. Her voice, saying I smelled of death. His voice, threatening to wait me out. The two of them laughing about selling the Chevy for scrap. That car had once held my husband's promises. Now it held my plan. Because sometimes a woman does not fight back with fists or rage. She fights back with patience. And a recorder. And a will. By the end of that month, I had over 40 hours of recordings. I kept them labeled in a little notebook I tucked into my nightstand. I cataloged them like memories, except these were not worth treasuring. They were evidence. What they said behind closed doors they never imagined I would one day play back in a courtroom. But I knew better. People like them, who think silence means weakness, always do their worst in whispers. I recorded the insults first. Small things, mutters, sneers, old parasite, walking guilt trip, that wrinkled ghost. Every cruel nickname etched into tape. Sometimes she would say it while passing by me in the hallway, not even bothering to whisper. "I swear I can smell her room from the driveway," she once told my son, laughing. "Do you think it's mold or just regret?" he chuckled. "Maybe both." One night, I caught her hissing through clenched teeth. "If I hear that old kettle whistle one more damn time, I'm going to lose it. She thinks she's the queen of this house. Boiling tea like she's got anything left to soothe." Then came the threats. "She is going to ruin everything," my son muttered in the kitchen. "I'm not waiting for her to croak. I will take that car out myself and torch it if she does not hand over the deed." I pressed stop. My thumb trembled on the recorder. That same night, I stepped into the garage after they had gone to bed. The Chevy sat beneath its tarp, quiet, dignified, like a soldier still standing post long after the war had ended. I brushed my hand along its side and whispered, "Not yet. Not them." The most damning tape came one rainy Thursday. "I have the buyer lined up," she said, phone on speaker, walking circles around the kitchen island. All we have to do is get the paperwork cleared before she realizes what's happening. We'll say she's not mentally sound, push her into signing under stress, and if not, we push her out. Push her out how? Asked the man on the phone. Leave that to me, she replied. I played that recording 3 times before saving it to a backup drive. I labeled it Plan to Force Eviction, but I needed more than words. So I looked for paper. I searched the recycling bin when they were out. They never shredded anything. I found credit card statements with red ink totals, thousands owed to online betting sites and liquor wholesalers. I found copies of bounced checks made out to Ace Realty Group, and a spreadsheet calculating net sale if inherited. I took photos of everything, every page, every handwritten note that included my name followed by the word problem. I emailed them to Alan, the lawyer. In one of the folders tucked beneath their mattress, yes, I looked there, I found a contract. It was unsigned, but predated for submission. The house was listed as in pre-sale negotiations, with an estimated value of $695,000. 0 cents. Under occupant displacement timeline, someone had scrawled 1-2 weeks max. I stared at those words for a long time. Occupant, that is what I had become in their eyes. Not mother, not grandmother, not even human, just a problem to be displaced. That night, I typed a full report of everything I had observed over the last 3 months. I included exact dates, phrases, digital copies of the will, and a personal statement. Alan responded in less than an hour. This is strong. Let me prepare a formal complaint and injunction. We will move forward. I sat at the kitchen table after midnight and looked around the house. The walls still had Thomas's shadow. The stairs still creaked where he used to kiss my cheek each morning. But the house no longer felt like home. Not with them in it. I packed a small bag with my essentials, my medicine, a few changes of clothes, the pressed flower in its psalms, and the key to the Chevy. I did not plan to leave, but I wanted to be ready in case I had to. The next morning, my daughter-in-law made a show of slamming every cabinet while I poured my tea. I said nothing. I let her noise fill the silence. Because I had something she did not. The truth, stacked and backed up, ready for court. I mailed a copy of everything, recordings, documents, photos, to Alan on a thumb drive. He called the next day. You have done exactly what needed to be done, he said. Now let the system speak. I hung up, stood in front of the mirror, and looked at myself. For the first time in months, I did not see someone old or small. I saw a woman preparing for war, with no guns, no armor, just patience and proof. 3 days after I mailed the final thumb drive to Alan, the air in the house shifted, not for me, but for them. There is a quiet that comes before a storm, a heaviness, like the world knows something is about to split wide open, and that morning I could feel it humming in the walls. They were at the dining table when it happened. Dinner had just been served, meatloaf from a frozen tray, overboiled potatoes, and green beans that had long lost their color. I sat at the far end, as I always did now, silent and invisible, picking at my plate while they spoke in hushed tones about open houses and spring listings. The doorbell rang. My daughter-in-law rolled her eyes, muttered something about packages, and waved my son up from his seat. He opened the door with his usual grunt, then fell silent. I watched him from across the room. The man standing in the doorway wore a simple navy blazer and held a plain envelope. He was calm, polite, and devastating. Mr. Harris? He asked. Yes, my son answered. You've been served. He placed the envelope into my son's stunned hands, nodded once at me across the room, and walked away without another word. My son just stood there, reading the first page. His face turned pale, then red, then a shade I had only seen once before, on the day we buried his father, but this time there were no tears, only rage. What the hell is this? He barked. My daughter-in-law snatched the papers from him. She skimmed quickly, then froze. This is a lawsuit, she hissed. A petition to invalidate inheritance, a restraining order, a motion to remove us from the premises? I calmly placed my fork on the plate. That's correct, I said. It is also a formal notice that you have 30 days to vacate, though I imagine your real estate agent might be disappointed. You went behind our backs? She screamed. No, I said, pushing my chair back. I walked in front of you. You just never bothered to look. She flew into a fit, shouting, cursing, knocking over her wineglass. My son paced like a man caught in a trap, hands on his head, muttering nonsense to himself, while she launched insult after insult at me across the table. "You selfish, bitter old witch, you want to die alone, is that it?" Neighbors began peeking through their windows. She screamed louder. "You'll rot in this house just like your husband did." I stood slowly and gathered my dishes. "Thomas did not rot," I said, turning to face her. "He rested. And he earned that rest. Something neither of you have ever done." She lunged forward, but my son held her back. I walked to the kitchen, rinsed my plate, and dried my hands on the towel with the little stitched cardinal, his favorite bird. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood knew. It started with whispers at the mailbox, then side glances at the grocery store. Then came the article. The town paper had picked up the court filing. Not the details, those were private. But the story was there, printed on page 2, beneath a photo of the old Chevy parked peacefully in the driveway. Veteran's widow upholds promise. Quiet, but unyielding. The reporter must have spoken to Alan, because the language was sharp but respectful. They wrote of a woman whose husband had served his country, and whose legacy was being threatened by greed. They quoted lines from the will and described me as a symbol of dignity in a time of disposability. That afternoon, someone left a pie on my porch. No note, just a clean apple pie in a red ceramic dish. The next day, a bouquet of tulips appeared on the step, then an envelope with a handwritten card. "We see you. We believe you. Thank you for standing firm." My daughter-in-law slammed doors for 3 days straight. My son did not speak to me. They moved about the house like ghosts who knew their time was running out. On the 5th night, I heard her sobbing in their bedroom. On the 6th, they stopped closing the door when they fought. On the 7th, I caught them on the porch, whispering about how much they could get for a quick out-of-state move. "You're going to leave?" I asked from the doorway. They turned, startled. "No," he said quickly. "We're just thinking." I nodded. "Good. Think hard. You have 23 days left." The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No grand chandeliers or polished oak panels, just 4 cream-colored walls, scuffed linoleum floors, and the smell of old coffee lingering near the clerk's desk. It was a Tuesday morning, gray and drizzling, the kind of day Thomas used to call honest weather, the kind that made you see everything for what it was. I wore my best coat, the navy wool one with the pearl buttons, and I brought the Psalms with me, not for legal purposes, but for strength. The flower was still inside, pressed gently as ever, a reminder of the man who had believed in structure, in legacy, in doing things the right way. My son and daughter-in-law sat across the aisle, dressed more for appearances than respect. She wore something too tight for a courtroom and too flashy for a church. He looked like he had not slept in days. His tie was crooked, and his eyes stayed downcast, refusing to meet mine. The judge, a middle-aged woman with lines around her mouth that suggested she had seen a great deal and laughed very little, read through the files silently for several minutes. The stack was thick. Recordings, bank statements, will certification, sworn affidavits, evidence of neglect, verbal abuse, premeditated displacement. When she finally looked up, her voice was clear and firm. "This court finds that the defendants, Mr. and Mrs. Harris, have violated both the moral obligation and legal conditions of the inheritance set forth in the decedent's will. The stipulations were unambiguous: care for the surviving spouse in good faith, or forfeit all rights to property and assets." My heart beat quietly, but steadily. "Given the extensive documentation provided," she continued, "including audio evidence of harassment, recorded intent to deceive and displace, and testimony from a third-party legal representative, I hereby rule that full ownership of the estate at 27 Granville Lane and the 1967 Chevrolet Impala shall revert to the plaintiff, Mrs. Eleanor Harris." She paused, eyes flicking toward my son. "Furthermore, the court finds sufficient grounds for a temporary restraining order to be granted for the safety and peace of the plaintiff. The defendants are to vacate the premises within 7 days of this ruling. Any failure to comply will result in legal enforcement and possible criminal charges for trespassing." I did not breathe until the gavel struck wood. They did not speak as we exited the courtroom, not to the judge, not to me, not even to each other. My daughter-in-law pulled her sunglasses on before we even reached the lobby, like that would protect her from the stares of the other townspeople sitting nearby. I walked out alone. It rained softly, soaking the steps as I made my way down, one hand on the railing, the other clutching the will that had brought me full circle, from wife to widow to witness. Back at the house, the silence was louder than the ruling. They avoided me in the days that followed. Boxes appeared, tapes stretched, furniture shuffled at odd hours. She hissed instructions through gritted teeth while he moved like a man who had lost more than a home. He had lost the illusion of decency. I gave them space. I did not gloat. I did not interfere. I let them pack their betrayal, one drawer at a time. On the morning of the 7th day, I rose early, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table, my table again, truly and legally. I watched the sun rise through the fog, and when I heard the front door open, I knew it was time. They did not say goodbye. They carried their last box to the car, closed the trunk, and drove off with their windows rolled up. No glances back, no apologies, just silence. I stepped out onto the porch, wrapped my shawl tight, and stood still as their vehicle disappeared down the street. The garden beds were empty now, the soil dry and waiting. I walked slowly down the steps and to the gate, checking the latch. Then I returned to the porch, shut the front door behind me, and slid the brass bolt into place. It clicked solidly. I cased the lock with both hands, pressing my palms against the wood, not as a wall to keep the world out, but as a promise fulfilled. He came back alone the next evening. I was in the garden, gloves on, coaxing life out of the dirt they had left bare. The daffodil bulbs I planted years ago had started to peek through the thawed soil, like they too had been waiting for peace. I heard the car pull into the driveway and recognized the engine immediately. It was not the Chevy, of course. That one had been safe in the garage ever since the court order had taken effect. This was his new car, leased under his wife's name, paid for with money they no longer had. He slammed the door and stalked toward me, fists clenched, jaw tight. His steps were heavy, filled with the kind of anger that comes not from injustice, but from exposure. I did not stand. I did not stop planting. He hovered over me, seething. "You ruined us," he hissed. "Do you know that? You humiliated us. You destroyed our reputation, our credit, our lives." I looked up, wiping my hands on the hem of my gardening apron. The sun behind him made his face a silhouette, just a shadow of the boy I once rocked to sleep. "You brought this to court over a rusty old car and a house that's falling apart," he continued, voice rising. "You tore this family in half over junk, Ma. Junk!" I stood slowly, looked him in the eyes. "No," I said softly, "I did not ruin this family. And I did not do it over a car." He flinched, like he had not expected me to speak. "You want to know what destroyed this family?" I asked, taking off one glove. "It was not the house, it was not the will, and it certainly was not the Chevy." He folded his arms. "Then what?" I stepped closer, close enough to see the years of entitlement etched into his face. "It was the moment you looked at me and saw a burden instead of a mother. The moment you decided that loyalty had an expiration date, that care was conditional, that love was negotiable." He said nothing. I continued, calm and clear. "You did not lose this house because of the court. You lost it the moment you stood by and let your wife throw my wedding photo into the mud. You lost it when you called me a parasite. You lost it when you tried to sell off the last piece of your father before the dirt had settled over his grave." He looked away. But I was not finished. "That car? That was not rust to me. That was the seat where I kissed your father goodbye before he went off to war. That was the back seat where you were conceived. That was the trunk that held the picnic basket he made with his bare hands, the one we used every Sunday for 20 years. That car held a life you never bothered to understand." His voice cracked then, just slightly. "I was trying to take care of my family." I shook my head. "You do not take care of a family by erasing the people who built it." He exhaled sharply, stepped back, angry again. "You could have just given it to me, all of it." "I am your son." I nodded slowly. "And I am your mother. But I am also my husband's widow. And this house, this land, that car, they were not just things he left behind. They were promises. And I do not break promises, even when the people I made them for forget how to keep theirs." He looked at the ground. I let the silence settle, heavy and necessary. Then I said it, the last thing I would ever say to him as the man who had once been my son. You say I destroyed this family over a car and an old house, I said. But the truth is, you were the one who burned down everything that mattered. And no, I was not talking about the car. He opened his mouth, as if to argue, but the words never came. I turned, walked back toward the flower bed, and knelt. Behind me I heard his car door slam again. And then nothing. Just the sound of wind moving through the trees. He did not come back. Not after that. The house sold in less than 2 weeks. A young couple with 2 daughters fell in love with the wraparound porch and the old-fashioned trim. They saw potential where others saw work. I saw release. I watched them walk the halls where my son once learned to walk, and I felt no bitterness, only relief. They asked if I had any advice. I told them to plant lavender near the back gate. The soil was rich there, and to let the wind chimes stay. They carried good memories. With the proceeds, I bought a small cabin near the coast. Nothing grand, just enough, a single story with white shutters and a view of the ocean. Thomas always said he wanted to fall asleep beside. It sat on a quiet stretch of Maine shoreline where gulls sang louder than traffic, and the mornings tasted like salt and pine. I moved in with only what I needed: my clothes, my books, my tea kettle, the Psalms, and my peace. I donated the Chevy to the Veterans Heritage Museum just before I left town. It took 3 men and a special trailer to transport her, but they handled her like the treasure she was. When they unveiled her 2 months later, she sat beneath warm lighting in the center of the exhibit, polished to a soft gleam, surrounded by photos of wartime couples and love letters from the front. The museum director asked if I wanted to include a plaque. I wrote it myself, by hand, preserved not by court order, but by love, driven by a veteran, guarded by his wife. Sometimes I visit her. I bring fresh flowers and leave them in the passenger seat. Kids walk by and point. Parents whisper the story like folklore. That was her car. She kept it through a war of her own. My life now is smaller but fuller. Every Tuesday I volunteer at the town library, reading to children in the afternoon sun. We sit on soft rugs near the back windows, and I tell stories with silly voices and long pauses. They laugh, and sometimes ask me to read the same tale twice. But sometimes, only sometimes, I tell them true stories. Quiet ones, brave ones. Stories where the hero is not young or strong or loud, but patient. Stories that end not with thunder, but with clarity. One day, after story time, a girl with red pigtails handed me a letter. It was from my granddaughter. She had tracked me down, found my new address through the museum. Her handwriting was neat, practiced, and just a little nervous. "Dear Grandma," it read, "Dad says you left us, but I think maybe you were pushed. I'm sorry I did not ask sooner. I remember your cinnamon tea and the way you hummed when you sewed. I remember the Chevy and how you let me turn the radio dial. I miss you. And one day, when I am older, I want to be like you, kind but not forgettable." I pressed the letter to my chest and cried, one deep, quiet cry. Not out of sadness, but something older, something like grace. In the front yard of my new home, I planted a wildflower garden. I used seeds from the bouquet Thomas had pressed, the one I had carried to his grave every year. I dug gently, smoothed the earth, and whispered his name with each sprinkle. Now, each morning, I step outside with my tea and watch the blooms sway with the breeze. White, purple, gold, tiny bursts of life that return without asking, that grow without apology. And I think of him. I do not bring the flower to his grave anymore, because I planted the whole garden instead, so he could see it every morning, with me. If you've made it this far, thank you. For listening, for remembering, and for understanding that some stories are quiet until they're not. I did not tell mine to seek pity. I told it so no other woman would doubt the strength she holds, even when the world calls her disposable. Because love does not die when the man is buried. Dignity does not end when the children turn cruel. And silence? Silence is not surrender. Sometimes, it's just the sound of a storm gathering its strength. If my story touched your heart, or reminded you of someone who deserves to be heard, please subscribe to Grandma True Stories. Here, We speak what was once left unsaid. And remember, revenge has no expiration date. Wisdom doesn't shout, it remembers. And when a grandma speaks, the world finally listens.